In my reading, El Matadero is a heteroglossic text in which we can hear the voices of federales as well as those of the story's unitario hero and author. Accordingly, in addition to reading Echeverria describe the federales as sodomites, we hear the federales describe unitarios as cajetillas, or dandies, who wear pistols para pintar, and who are in general pintores como el diablo. This could be translated into English as saying that unitarios show off and are show-offs. It's worth observing, though, that in Spanish the insult is related to painting oneself into pretending to be what one is not, that is, with feminine masquerade. The federales in the story also celebrate their own manliness, which they confirm by shedding the blood of cattle and of unitarios, and by sodomizing the latter. In sum, the traits that confirm the manliness of each group are used by the other groups to cast doubt on that same manliness. Moreover, even in this text that is taken to be pro-unitario, we can hear doubts expressed about the traits that unitarios would use to confirm their own manliness. My contention is that these two competing models of masculinity run through Argentine culture from independence until very recently. I believe each model is an example of what Thomas calls mechanisms for assuaging anxiety caused by the visibility of the male body. These mechanisms are never entirely effective and never could be. Different classes of Argentine men found different mechanisms somewhat effective, but they could not completely avoid the doubt cast by the other classes of men. Nevertheless, the mechanisms were still doing their job when I conducted field work among soccer fans in Buenos Aires in the mid-90s. Unitarios and federales no longer exist, but the fans of Argentina's two biggest soccer clubs sought to confirm their own masculinity and attack the masculinity of the players and fans of the other club according to the models that unitarios and federales may have found familiar. Like the unitarios, fans of the River Plate club accused Boca Junior players and fans of being sodomitical brutes, while fans of the Boca Junior club, like the federales, accused players and fans of River Plate of being effeminate dandies. According to River fans, their own players were real men because they were stylish and heterosexual. But Boca fans found those very same traits to be evidence of a lack of manliness. In the words of a character in a story by Borges, a man who thinks 5 minutes straight about a woman no es un hombre sino un marica. That is, isn't a man but a fad. Similarly, according to Boca fans, their own players were real men because they dominated other men, but those were the very same traits that River fans took to be evidence of unmanly homosexuality. From 1994 to 1998, Daniel Pasarela coached Argentina's national soccer team. Upon assuming the coach's position, Pasarela imposed a policy of not capping players who kept their hair long or who wore earrings. To cap a player is to name him to the national team. The policy was most apparent in Pasarela's decision not to cap Fernando Redondo, a long-haired player who was just then coming into his own as midfielder for Real Madrid. I believe Pasarela recognized that neither way of being a manly Argentine soccer player was working as well as it had. His solution was to use whiteness to show up manliness. That is why he not only banned both long-haired ladies' men and tough men's men, he also favored square-jawed, light-skinned players such as Javier Zanetti, Claudio Lopez, and Hernan Crespo. And he justified his policy and his preferences by saying he had to think of the image the Argentine national team would project when it changed planes in Frankfurt. Pasarela's policy created a controversy which came to a head in July 1995 when Argentina's premier sports magazine El Gráfico published an interview with Pasarela in which, trying to get to the bottom of the policy, the magazine asked the manager if he would cap a homosexual. Pasarela answered with a simple no. Note that Pasarela just excluded two types of soccer player, homosexuals and players who kept their hair long or wore earrings. In other words, he excluded players whose manliness was compromised either by same-sex sexual behavior or by effeminacy. A week after the interview, Carlos Jauregui, the president of a gay civil rights organization, declared that Pasarela's policy of excluding gays was irrelevant because there were already gays on the national team. For several weeks, responses to Pasarela's policy and Jauregui's claim dominated the Argentine media, and not just the sports pages. Some commentators who supported Passarella observed that the image of the national team presented to the world sorely needed to be cleaned up after the cocaine use and all-around boorish behavior of Diego Maradona, seen here, that culminated in his expulsion for doping from the 1994 World Cup, and according to today's newspapers, may lead to his expulsion from the 2010 World Cup as well. If any of you have been following. In retrospect, I now see that Passarella's futile attempt to shore up the manliness of the national team was the last graft of what Kaja Silverman calls a scopic regime. Here it is useful to compare sports spectatorship in Argentina with what in the US Laurel Davis argues about sports spectatorship in as seen in Sports Illustrated. Davis argues that the thoroughly male field of vision in US sports produced anxiety that is similar to the anxiety I found in Argentine soccer. Davis interprets the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue as a mechanism for assuaging that masculine anxiety. And I picked this cover because the model on the left is Valeria Massa, who's an Argentine model, joined by Tyra Banks. Briefly stated, Davis observed that readers of Sports Illustrated, who are presumed to be men, take passionate pleasure in looking at photos of athletic bodies, almost always male, caught by the camera at a moment of intense strain or release. Davis writes, a strong declaration of heterosexual status by Sports Illustrated may be necessary to ward off any homosexual feminine connotations that men's sporting practices convey. Thus, one function of the annual swimsuit issue is to assuage male masculine anxiety by assuring Sports Illustrated's readership that there's nothing homosexual or feminine about watching or playing sports. The swimsuit issue allows men to rest easy in the knowledge that sports fandom is an entirely heterosexual and manly activity. I've observed that El Gráfico, of which these are just two covers, was the Argentine equivalent of Sports Illustrated in the US, but it was even more thoroughly male than Sports Illustrated. And El Gráfico paid even less attention to female athletes. There was occasionally a photo of a female celebrity posing in a uniform of her favorite soccer club, but there was nothing like the swimsuit issue. Some of El Gráfico's ads did picture sexually posed women, but again, not nearly to the degree as Sports Illustrated. I believe that the relentless maleness of El Gráfico and of the whole Argentine soccer scene contributed to the demise of its scopic regime. An identity as a ladies' man fails to convince when there are no ladies to be seen. And the identity of men's men depended on a sex-gender system in which men who have sex with men are admired if it is believed they are the penetrator, and stigmatized only if it is believed they are the penetrated. With the globalization of the Anglo concept of gayness, the sex-gender system that only stigmatized the presumed penetrated was on the wane, at least in Buenos Aires. So another reason the mechanisms for assuaging anxiety failed was that appearing to be a top no longer marked a difference.